Last week on the channel, we broke down some of the strongest Pokemon that you guys can find at the end of your journey. But what about some Pokemon you're able to encounter from the start? Pokemon at its core is a game where you're meant to deepen your bonds with Pokemon of all kinds, and some of these Pokemon you'll find as early as Route 1 are easily up there for some of the best you can get in the entire game. Between things like regional birds, strong trait evolutions, and sometimes just Pokemon that don't have to evolve to be good, the early game still has a wide array of strong Pokemon at your disposal, sometimes even too good. Today, let's break down the top 10 best Pokemon you can find in the early game, so you guys can get an idea at what kind of Pokemon you'll be able to get from the start. We'll only be counting Pokemon that typically are found in the early game, so while some of these mons have a game or two they're not available until the middle or end, you're almost certain to find these more often than not before you've obtained a couple of gym badges. With all that out of the way, before we start, Mismagius and HeartGold Randomizer Hardcore Nuzlocke. Link will be in the description below. Now, let's begin. Starting off this list, we have one of the best regional birds. Staraptor was a huge improvement from previous generations' regional birds, starting off with an actual strong stat distribution. Staraptor's high base 120 attack stat allows it to easily outdamage most of your early route bird Pokemon like Pidgeot and Swellow, while still sharing their typing of normal and flying. While this type typically struggles against rock and steel types, Staraptor also has access to close combat through its level up pool in order to handle both of these. There frankly are a lot of good flying types for your in-game teams, but I think Staraptor is certainly among the best. In the number 9 slot on today's list, we have a Pokemon that's entire reputation is based on being annoying and competitive. But what if I told you this is actually a really strong option for your playthroughs as well? At number 9, we're going to discuss Clefable today, the Generation 1 normal type that became a fairy in Generation 6. I'd honestly say even before Clefable became a fairy type though, one of the greatest things in its corner was certainly the gift of having a pure normal type with rather okay stats. While all of Clefable's stats are below 100, it doesn't exactly have a terrible stat distribution. It's kinda just there. When you combine this with the fact you can actually obtain Clefable fairly early on due to just requiring a Moonstone to evolve, Clefable is certainly going to be able to feature itself as a strong member of your team, even as a normal type. Having only a single weakness is a huge deal, especially when Clefable has a wide array of TMs you can teach it in order to beat certain matchups. Options like Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Psychic, and Flamethrower, plus many others in previous generations, were a huge deal for Clefable in order to help it stand out among other early normal types. Clefable as a fairy type is even more potent, and as a normal type previously, it also keeps its coverage needed for fairy's weakness. Clefable also learns plenty of fairy attacks like Moonblast, which provide Clefable with a very powerful stab move that now will actually deal super effective damage against most trainers. While I don't know for certain if I would have ranked normal type Clefable in today's list, I truly think this fairy type buff is what makes Clefable go from a fairly good option in-game into an absolute powerhouse for any team, despite what its stats might tell you. One of the strongest Pokemon, strictly in terms of its sheer damage output, is somehow available within the first badge or two of your entire playthrough. Coming in at number 8 is his offensive behemoth, a Pokemon that can outdamage the most offensive legendary Pokemon, being Azumarill. Yeah, you heard me right. Azumarill can outdamage most legendary Pokemon you'd throw in front of it thanks to its ability Huge Power, an ability that doubles Azumarill's physical attack stat. This means Azumarill is able to bring its pretty mediocre attack stat up to a point where most enemies will be lucky to take a single attack. When you're playing through most early games, this meant in Generation 3, you'd have a Pokemon that could fire off strong moves like Double Edge without much worry. But Azumarill proceeds to become a much stronger offensive threat the further the generations went on. Azumarill probably was one of the most rewarded Pokemon in the game by the physical special split, allowing Azumarill a second stab of water to finally deal actual physical damage when you're using moves like Waterfall. But Azumarill still continued to evolve, becoming a Fairy type in Generation 6, making it arguably one of your best choices for the early game in terms of an offensive tank. If it wasn't for the base 50 mediocre speed, Azumarill would honestly be an offensive nightmare. But thankfully, Azumarill was created in a generation Game Freak actually still cared about, balancing their game. Aqua Jet is also an egg move, which most players don't have access to for an in-game run, at least until Gen 9, where the Mirror Herb exists. Coming in at number 7, we have a Pokemon you're able to just start using pretty early on, and it already has some high rewards, being Hawlucha. Hawlucha's typing alone of flying and fighting earns it a strong mention on our list, since for the early stages, this will usually already pay off against typically beginning bosses, such as your rock, bug, normal, and grass type gyms. Hawlucha also not having an evolution means you're starting off with a Pokemon that has a fairly usable 92 attack and a speed stat of 118, which even at like the final stages of the game will come in a lot of handy. Hawlucha gets access to a lot of strong moves, like Flying Press and High Jump Kick through its level up, and most importantly, a Stab Acrobatics. Since most of you guys probably aren't giving out held items to your Pokemon while playing the games, Hawlucha will be able to use this move as a 110 base power flying type attack whenever you receive the TM in-game, which is usually fairly early on. This gives Hawlucha a fairly high stab option that is also typically a difficult type for most trainers you'll encounter to defeat. With only resistances to electric, rock, and steel, it's no wonder to see why this is easily one of Hawlucha's most powerful attacks. For a Pokemon you can usually get within your first couple of badges, it's certainly a strong powerhouse for this list. At number 6, we have all the starter Pokemon. This isn't an entry specifically for just one starter, as all starters are different, so I figured just putting them all at number 6 would suffice. You have your starter from the get-go, and at least 95% of the time, they will be on your team no matter what, because players usually build teams revolving around them. Some amazing starters are of course Infernape, Blaziken, Meowscarada, Torterra, Skeledirge, Greninja, and more. If I were doing specific starter Pokemon slots, obviously some of the mons I mentioned would be higher than number 6, but I think grouping all the starter Pokemon at number 6 is a good compromise. But no matter what starter you pick, they will always carry you through the game one way or another. So I think number 6 is a good enough spot for them. Starting off the second half of the list, we have a Generation 1 classic that's always been completely tearing through the in-game bosses. Alakazam takes our number 5 spot, with the Psychic typing being an absolute game changer against most of the other trainers you'll face. This is where the strong 135 special attack Alakazam provides comes into play, since it's truly difficult to find a trainer who will have a single Pokemon that survives the combination of Focus Blast, Shadow Ball, and Psychic. Alakazam is the dictionary definition of a glass cannon, meaning it will typically keep winning until your opponent finally finds a way to properly revenge what's most likely one of your strongest offensive options. While you can bring a couple of Pokemon that will be able to break as well as Alakazam while actually taking hits, Alakazam is an option you'll usually be able to obtain by the 20s. This ensures it that it will absolutely be able to shatter most bosses before they even have Pokemon in the middle evolution stages. Even if you are unable to trade with someone to evolve one, you'll probably get similar mileage out of Kadabra. just due to how hard it is for trainers to combat a fast psychic type, with Kadabra reaching 105 speed and its evolution attaining a blistering 120 base speed. The reason Alakazam isn't in the top 3 is solely because it's a trait evolution, and not everyone is going to have access to it. But the sheer power it has balances it out to at least being in the top 5. If it didn't evolve via trade, I can guarantee you it would be in the top 3 without a doubt. For our number 4 slot today, we have another evolution stone Pokemon with plenty of strong TM access, being Nidoking. Nidoking has a fairly strong offensive typing of poison and ground, which over the generations has become even more valuable with the introduction of the fairy typing. Nidoking is able to destroy grass, electric, steel, rock, fire, poison, and now fairy types as well ever since Generation 6. This allows Nidoking, even with just a couple of TMs, to become a fairly potent offensive monster, especially when you factor in how Earthquake is always available as a TM in every game. There is definitely a big issue though that keeps Nidoking out of the top 3, and that's its reliance on TMs. If you want Nidoking to be good, you're absolutely required to teach it a few TMs. This isn't really up for debate either, since in most games, you'll only get Earth Power and Mega Horn for actual good moves, with your other options including Peck, Double Kick, Poison Sting, and Thrash. Once you open up your selection of TMs though, you'll end up gaining access to moves like Sludge Bomb, Poison Jab, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, etc. Nidoking has better coverage than most normal type Pokemon, which historically have been known for their strong coverage move selection. Nidoking having such a wide TM learn set is probably the biggest reason you'd need for using this Pokemon. And I can't think of a better use for your Moonstone than this Pokemon right here. Leading off the top 3 is going to be the new Ghost and Fighting type, Annihilape, which manages to terrorize any in-game playthrough you'll do in the Paldea region. With your newly added Ghost typing, Annihilape is provided one of the strongest offensive typings in the game, which currently, besides Annihilape, only belongs to Marshadow, which is still one of the best Pokemon of all time. Unless you're Hisui and Zoroark, you're not going to find anything that will comfortably switch around both Ghost and Fighting attacks, due to the near-perfect neutral coverage this typing provides against every dual typing in the game. I don't know who at Game Freak was a massive fan of Primeape, but congrats, you managed to make it into a truly terrifying Pokemon that most trainers will not handle. Where Annihilape really shines though is Rage Fist. Rage Fist allows Annihilape to gain 50 base damage just by taking damage. After even just one attack, Rage Fist suddenly becomes a base 100 Ghost type move, and it'll only continue the snowball even further if the trainer can even take this strong of a Ghost move. This stab combination will truly prove to overwhelm most trainers you face. And while Annihilape certainly is a monstrous Pokemon, I'm going to hold off on ranking Annihilape any further than 3rd for the time being, due to the fact we've only seen it in a single game so far. With this next entry too, it's had a pretty credible history since its debut, so it's not hard to see why this thing is up next. And some of you might be mad at me for it. Hey, how you doing? I know a lot of you guys love when I talk about this Pokemon, and for a list like this, I had to talk about it. Hi Guardy! While this Pokemon is certainly a personal favorite of mine, putting my bias aside, I certainly think this is one of the strongest Pokemon you can find early on in your adventure. Gardevoir has been a staple of strong in-game teams ever since its introduction in Generation 3. With a terrifying Psychic typing that later on becomes a Psychic Fairy typing, this new buff to Gardevoir definitely makes it a true standout among the available pool of Pokemon. This is also the reason as to why I chose Guardy at number 2 rather than Annihilape. The Fairy typing helps Gardevoir a lot, since you'll not only have your psychic stabs that combat poison types, but you'll also be able to pressure dark types that otherwise have an immunity to your psychic types. This gives Gardevoir a huge edge in my eyes when you take on the Elite Four, since Hoenn and Kalos will include dark and dragon type opponents in their rosters, which I should also mention the fairy typing obliterates. You'll also have Alola and Paldea with fairly late dragon and dark type trainers as well. Not to mention in Galar, Gardevoir also has its share of opponents it does well against. Gardy also has fairly good access to TMs, and with them, they help it hold up to Alakazam. Moves such as Shadow Ball, Thunderbolt, and Focus Blast help it combat most trainers and generations before you get the fairy typing. Also with the fairy typing, Gardevoir gets Moonblast, and Moonblast shreds. Gardevoir definitely has some other advantages even outside of its typing over other psychic Pokemon, however. Even compared to Alakazam, for example, while Gardevoir isn't as fast, you're actually able to survive an attack, which is a huge deal. Gardevoir having a base 80 speed is still really strong for in-game enemies as well, which means while you aren't going to outpace every opponent, you're probably fine. Gardevoir also, unlike Alakazam, can actually get more than just Psychic through level up. Gardevoir gets access to some Fairy type attacks, which should hopefully help Gardevoir need to rely less on your TMs in later generations. There's a lot going for Gardevoir in terms of its type matchups, and I'm fully convinced that Gardevoir is easily going to be one of your strongest choices you can invest in for your journey. If you're able to let it gain experience in the back until it gets more than just teleport from moves, you're going to be positioning yourself to have one of the best Pokemon you can possibly find in the early portion of your story. And at the number 1 spot today is a Pokemon with roots in Generation 1. We have a pretty noteworthy fish to talk about that has managed to be a true in-game titan for generations, with the number 1 entry going to none other than Gyarados. Gyarados is a Generation 1 staple that has continued to receive plenty of buffs over the generations. Things like its ability Intimidate it received in Generation 3 and the physical special split in Generation 4 have allowed Gyarados a place to shine in terms of beating opponents in your journey. Gyarados quickly will receive moves like Waterfall, Ice Fang, and Crunch depending on the game you're playing, which give it already a good set of physical moves near its evolution at level 20. When you combine these with TMs like Earthquake, Gyarados becomes a force to be reckoned with on most of your journeys, with your typing of Water and Flying providing you with an immunity to Ground, as well as key resistances to typings like Water, Bug, Fighting, Steel, and Fire. Gyarados actually also proves to be an incredibly difficult Pokemon for your opponent to KO. This allows Gyarados to not only survive multiple attacks, but also to KO most opponents in order to wipe out most teams with ease, and to even solo most boss battles you'll encounter in any modern generation. I understand leveling up Magikarp can be a pain in some gens, but if you can hold out and level it up, Gyarados can truly be the best Pokemon. I place Gyarados very highly just because you have access to it very early on in pretty much all the Pokemon games. You get it pretty much right when you get the Olderod. The availability it has given players for generations can easily be argued for making it a contender for the top number 1 spot. Also, having Dragon Rage 1-2-hit KO most opponents for a good chunk of the game is also another important reason why it's number 1. Well, that wraps up our list for the best early game Pokemon across the franchise. What Pokemon did you guys find to be the most surprising to be on the list today? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below.